My parents convinced my husband to marry my sister because I was infertile, and after 10 years they were shocked to see my child. About 11 years ago, I went to the doctor for some tests because I'd been feeling off. After several appointments, they discovered I was infertile. The doctors told me my ovaries didn't function properly, and there was no chance I'd ever have kids. I was 28 at the time, married to Josh for 3 years. We'd always assumed we'd have children someday, nothing too planned out, just a normal expectation. When I got home, I told Josh the news. He stopped what he was doing, hugged me, and said we'd figure it out together. For a few days he was there for me, making sure I wasn't alone in it. I felt like we could handle this as a team. A week later, I decided to tell my parents. I went to their house and explained what the doctors had found. My mom started crying immediately, and my dad called it a terrible misfortune. Their reaction hit me hard. I'd been managing okay until then, but seeing them so upset made me question everything. I started feeling like this infertility defined me, like it was some kind of curse I couldn't escape. Josh was my rock right after the diagnosis. That first night, after I told him about the infertility, he held me for a long time. He said it didn't change how he felt about me, that we'd build a life together no matter what. The next day, he took off work just to stay home with me. He cooked dinner, some pasta thing he knew I liked, and we watched a movie to take my mind off it. For about a week, he kept checking in, asking how I was holding up. He even looked up stuff online about adoption, saying we had options if we wanted them later. It wasn't perfect, but it made me feel like I wasn't alone. I thought we were solid, that this was something we'd get through together. But then things shifted. After that first week, he stopped bringing it up. He'd still hug me if I asked, but he didn't start it anymore. He went back to work, and when he came home, he'd just sit there, quiet. I tried to talk about how I was feeling, and he'd listen, but his answers got shorter. "Yeah, that sucks," he'd say, or, "I don't know what to tell you." A month in, he was barely talking to me at all. He'd play video games or scroll his phone, and I'd be in the same room, feeling invisible. I kept waiting for him to snap back to the guy he'd been, but he didn't. 6 months after the diagnosis, he was a different person, cold, distant, like he'd checked out. I didn't know it then, but he was already slipping away when I told my parents about the infertility. It was a week after the diagnosis. I went to their house, sat them down at the kitchen table, and just said it. The doctors found out I couldn't have kids. My mom's face went pale, and then she started crying, loud and messy. My dad didn't say anything at first, just stared at the table. Then he shook his head and said it was a terrible misfortune. That phrase stuck with me. It made it sound like I'd brought some kind of doom on the family. My mom kept going, saying how they'd always pictured grandkids running around, how this was going to ruin everything. She asked what I'd done wrong, like it was my fault, even though I told her it was just how my body was. My dad chimed in, saying it was a shame, that Josh deserved better than this. I hadn't even mentioned Josh yet, but they were already thinking about him. They didn't ask how I was doing, not really, just kept talking about how sad it was for them, how they'd been so excited to be grandparents. It went on for an hour, them crying and ranting, me sitting there taking it. I'd gone in thinking they'd comfort me, but instead they made it worse. When I left, I felt empty. Their words kept replaying in my head, terrible misfortune, and I started believing it. I'd been holding it together with Josh's help, but after that, I fell apart. I couldn't stop thinking that I was broken, that my life was over because of this one thing. My parents didn't call to check on me after. They just let me sit with it, and that silence hurt almost as much as what they'd said 6 months after the diagnosis. My parents came to our house unannounced. Josh and I were in the kitchen. He'd been distant all day, barely talking. They knocked, walked in, and sat down like they owned the place. My mom started right away. She said they'd been thinking about my infertility and how it affected Josh. They'd decided it would be better if he left me. My dad nodded and said Josh deserved a family, kids of his own, and since I couldn't give him that, he should date my sister, Emily. Emily was 25, single, and fertile, they said, like that was all that mattered. They talked about it like it was a business deal, like I wasn't even there. They didn't ask how I felt or what I wanted. They just laid it out. Josh should divorce me and marry Emily instead. I looked at Josh, waiting for him to say something. He'd been my husband for 3 years. I needed him to stand up for me. But he didn't. He stared at the table, hands in his lap, and then he said he agreed. He said he'd been thinking about it too, that he wanted kids, and if I couldn't have them, maybe my parents were right. I couldn't believe it. The guy who'd hugged me, who'd promised we'd figure it out together, was sitting there saying he'd rather be with my sister. My stomach twisted, and my chest felt tight, but I didn't cry. I just got up and went to our bedroom. I shut the door and sat on the bed, staring at the wall. Josh didn't follow me. That night, he slept on the couch. The next day, we barely spoke. A week later, we started talking about separating. He didn't fight it, didn't even try to fix things. He said he'd already talked to Emily, and she was okay with it. My parents had set it all up behind my back. Within a month, Josh moved out. He took his clothes, his gaming stuff, and left the house to me. I was alone, 28 years old, with no husband and no idea what to do next. My parents didn't call to check on me after that. They got what they wanted. Josh and Emily were dating within weeks. I heard from a cousin that they were already planning a future together, talking about kids. I didn't confront them. I didn't have the energy. I just stayed in the house, trying to figure out how my whole life had fallen apart so fast. After Josh moved out, I was on my own. The house felt empty without him, but I didn't have the money or the will to move. I kept working my job, office admin stuff, nothing exciting, but it was enough to pay the bills. For the first few months, I didn't do much else. I'd go to work, come home, eat, and sleep. I didn't talk to my parents or Emily. They didn't reach out either. I heard through family that Josh and Emily were officially together, living in an apartment across town. It stung, but I tried not to think about it. I deleted social media so I wouldn't see their updates. About a year after the separation, I met someone new. His name was Mark. We ran into each other at a coffee shop. I'd spilled my drink, and he helped me clean it up. He was 30, worked in IT, and seemed normal enough. We started talking, then dating. I told him early on about my infertility. I didn't want to waste time if it was a deal breaker. He said it didn't matter to him. He didn't care about having kids. That was a relief. For the first time in a while, I felt like someone actually wanted me, not some version of me that could pop out babies. We got serious fast. 6 months in, he moved into my house. It wasn't perfect, but it was steady. He cooked, I cleaned, we watched TV together. It was simple, and I needed simple. Then, out of nowhere, I got pregnant. I noticed I was late, took a test, and it was positive. I couldn't believe it. I went to the doctor, expecting them to say it was a mistake, but they confirmed it. They said my original diagnosis must have been wrong, something about misreading tests, or my condition improving. They called it a miracle, said the odds were insanely low. I was 30 now, and suddenly I was going to be a mom. Mark was shocked but happy. He said it didn't change anything for him, that he was in either way. I didn't tell my parents or Josh or Emily. I didn't want them anywhere near this. For once, something good was happening, and it was mine. The pregnancy went fine. I had checkups every few weeks, and the doctors kept saying everything looked normal. Mark stayed supportive. He came to appointments, helped set up a crib, painted the spare room. We didn't plan a big announcement or anything. I wasn't posting about it online or calling people up. But word got out anyway. A friend from work saw me buying baby stuff and asked about it. I told her the truth, and she must have told someone else, because soon it was all over my old circle. My cousin texted me one day, asking if it was true I was pregnant. I said yeah, and she said she couldn't believe it after everything. I didn't ask her to keep it quiet, didn't see the point. A month later, my parents showed up at my door. I was 7 months along by then, barely obvious. They hadn't contacted me since pushing Josh to leave, over 2 years ago. My mom started crying when she saw me, said they'd heard from family I was pregnant. My dad stood behind her, looking awkward. They said they were sorry, that they'd made a mistake back then. They wanted to be part of my life again, meet the baby when it came. I didn't let them in. I told them I needed time, closed the door, and that was it. Mark asked if I was okay after they'd been loud enough for him to hear from the living room. I said I was fine, just didn't want them around. I'd spent too long rebuilding without them. Josh called a week after that. He said he'd heard about the baby too. He sounded off, like he didn't know what to say. He asked how it happened, and I told him the doctors got it wrong. He said he was happy for me, but it didn't sound real. I found out later from my cousin that he and Emily had broken up a few months before. She cheated on him with some guy from her job, and he'd moved out. I didn't feel bad for him. He'd made his choice back then. I kept the call short, said I had to go, and hung up. My life was mine now, me, Mark, and the kid on the way. I wasn't letting any of them back in. The baby came right on time. I went into labor at 39 weeks, and after 12 hours I had a boy. We named him Ethan. He was healthy, 7 pounds, 6 ounces, no complications. The doctors checked him over and said he was perfect. Mark was there the whole time, holding my hand, cutting the cord. We took him home 2 days later. The house didn't feel empty anymore. Ethan's crib was in the spare room, and his stuff, bottles, diapers, little clothes, was all over. Mark took a week off work to help, and we figured out the new routine together. I didn't tell my parents or Josh about the birth. They didn't need to know. Ethan grew fast. By 6 months, he was crawling, grabbing everything he could reach. He had Mark's eyes and my nose, and he was always smiling. The doctors kept up with regular checkups, and they said he was hitting all the milestones ahead of schedule. At a year, he started walking, then talking, simple words like mama and dada. I went back to work part-time, and Mark's mom watched Ethan during the day. We didn't need much, just enough to keep the bills paid and food on the table. I didn't think about my old life much anymore. Josh, Emily, my parents, they were background noise now. My parents tried reaching out again when Ethan was about 18 months old. They sent a letter, no call or visit this time. It said they were sorry again, that they wanted to meet their grandson. They wrote about how they messed up, how they regretted pushing Josh and Emily together. I read it, then threw it out. Mark saw me do it, and asked if I'd ever forgive them. I said maybe someday, but not now. Ethan was mine, and I wasn't ready to share him with people who'd thrown me away. Josh never called again after that one time. I heard he moved out of town, started over somewhere else. Emily, I didn't know about. She dropped off the family radar after the breakup. None of it mattered. My days were Ethan's messy hands, Mark's quiet company, and a life I'd built from scratch. Ethan kept growing, and life settled into a rhythm. By 3, he was running around the house, asking questions about everything, why the sky was blue, where dogs went at night. He was smart, picking up words fast and figuring things out on his own. The preschool teacher said he was ahead of the other kids, always the first to finish puzzles or count to 20. Mark and I didn't push him, we just let him be. He'd sit with me in the kitchen while I cooked, chattering about his day, and Mark would build block towers with him after work. We weren't rich, but we had enough. I went full-time at the office again, and Mark got a promotion, so money wasn't tight anymore. My parents sent another letter when Ethan turned 4. Same stuff, apologies, asking to see him. They included a picture of themselves, older now, standing in their backyard. I kept it on the counter for a day, then tossed it. Mark didn't ask this time, he knew my answer. I didn't hate them, but I didn't trust them either. They'd chosen Emily and Josh over me, and that wasn't something I could forget. Ethan didn't need grandparents who'd only show up when it suited them. He had Mark's mom, who spoiled him with cookies and toys, and that was plenty. Josh's name came up once more, years later. Ethan was 6, starting 1st grade. My cousin mentioned Josh was back in town, working some construction job. She said he'd asked about me, if I was happy, if the kid was doing okay. I told her I didn't care what he was up to. He'd walked out, picked my sister, and that was that. Ethan didn't know about him, or Emily, or any of it. He knew Mark as his dad, and that's all he needed. Our life was quiet, school drop-offs, weekend trips to the park, dinners at home. Ethan was healthy, happy, and sharp as anything. The past didn't touch us anymore. Ethan's 10 now, and this whole mess feels like a lifetime ago. He's tall for his age, acing school, and already talking about wanting to be a doctor, ironic, given how this started. Mark and I are still together, solid as ever. We got married when Ethan was 5, nothing fancy, just a courthouse thing. The house is louder these days, full of Ethan's projects and friends. I'm 38, still at the same job, but I'm up for a manager spot soon. Mark's in IT still, steady as always. We're not perfect, but we're good. My parents stopped reaching out a couple years back. Last I heard, they were still in the same house, getting older and quieter. I don't know if they ever patched things up with Emily. She's off somewhere, no one's sure where. Josh is around town, I guess. Saw him once at the grocery store last year, didn't talk, just nodded and kept walking. He looked tired, older than he should. I don't wish him bad, but I don't wish him anything, really. They all made their choices back then. 10 years ago, I thought my life was over. Doctors said I'd never have kids, my husband left, my parents picked my sister over me. Then Ethan happened, a miracle, they called it, and I built something new. My kid's smart, healthy, and mine. That's what matters. The rest? It's just noise I don't hear anymore.